Today for our Bible story, we are going to learn about three friends and something that happened to them. You may have heard this story before from the Bible. Now, a long, long time ago, there was a king, and his name was Nebuchadnezzar. His name is really, really long. But that was his name, King Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the king of a place called Babylon. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar had taken his army into the land where God's people lived, and God's people had disobeyed him, and they had sinned. And remember, we had talked about that before, how they kept making poor choices. Well, they did it again. They sinned, and sin always has to be punished. We talk about that, right? There's consequences. So what happened was God let the army of the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, win this battle. And after the battle, the king took some of God's people back to Babylon where they would work for him in his palace. And some of these people were young men. Now the king wanted the young men to learn how to speak his language and to serve him there. One of these young men was named Daniel. Now Daniel had three friends, and they have some crazy names too. Daniel's three friends were named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they helped around where the king was, and they did what they were supposed to do. Now, God's word tells us that Daniel decided that he was going to love and serve the Lord, even though he was in this strange land. And the great and powerful king of the land always knew that Daniel did what was right, because Daniel lived right there and the king could watch him. Okay, and because Daniel was faithful to God, God gave him very, very important jobs to do to help the king in special ways. Now that made the king happy. The king, though, did not love God. He didn't serve God, and the king made Daniel one of his leaders, even though Daniel obeyed God. Now, Daniel also helped his three friends get some important jobs for the king. Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful king. He had a lot of power, and he had a lot of money and land and things, and he began to think about how great he was, and he started to get proud. We've talked about pride before, right, and how it's not good. Well, he started to get proud, and he thought about how great he was, and he even had a golden idol built that looked just like him. So there was this big golden statue that looked just like the king. And he sent for all the leaders of the great land to come to the palace and to worship this idol. And he made a law. Okay, he had this rule. And the rule was that whenever the music played, the instruments played, everybody had to come and fall down and worship the statue. And the king said that anyone who did not obey this was going to be thrown into this fiery furnace. Lots and lots of fire in there if they didn't obey. Well, Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't obey the king's rule. They knew that it was wrong, and they didn't obey. They loved God, and they worshiped only God, so they didn't want to bow down to the statue. They knew that God did not want them doing that, okay? So when the proud king found out, he was really angry with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he commanded that they be thrown into the fiery furnace. That was the rule, and so they had to get thrown in there. And he even made it really, really hot. And he had his strongest soldiers tie the men up and throw them into the burning furnace. Now, do you think these men were afraid, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? It was real fire. It was a real fiery furnace. Now, when the soldiers took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the furnace, when they were going to throw them in, it was so hot, the heat from the flames and everything was so hot that it even killed the soldiers that were around there. That tells us how hot it was. But the three men stayed alive. And King Nebuchadnezzar came over and he looked into the fiery furnace, and he couldn't believe what he saw. He stood up quickly and he asked, he's like, didn't we throw 3 men into this fiery furnace? And they said, yes, king, that's what we did. And he said, but look, there are 4 men walking around in there down in the fire. They're not even hurt. And one of them looks like he might be the Son of God. Then the king walked over to the furnace and he called to them, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come out of the furnace. And they came out. The king and all the leaders of the land came up close to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They saw that the fire had not even touched them. Their hair was fine. It wasn't burned up. Their clothes weren't burned. They didn't even really smell like smoke or fire. God had protected them. King Nebuchadnezzar praised Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God, who had sent protection for these 3 men. Now, what lesson can we learn? Well, a lot of lessons, right? God always protects us. He always looks after us. And we always need to obey God and to trust God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have said, God won't know. I'm just going to bow down to this golden idol, right? But they didn't do that. They made a right choice, and they said, nope, we're not going to do the wrong thing. We love God, and we're only going to worship God. And so they obeyed God and trusted God, and because of that, God protected them in the fire.